Sweat pooled under Declan's bearskin cap. He had ignored fainting tourists and bomb threats with the same stone-faced apathy. But when the little girl with scraped knees slammed into his boots, sobbing, "He's not my dad," the man chasing her stopped dead. And Declan broke protocol. The asphalt radiated a dry, suffocating heat that baked through the thick leather of Declan's boots. August in London was a miserable affair, especially when you were encased in heavy scarlet wool and a towering bearskin cap that felt like wearing a dead animal in a sauna. Declan's shoulder screamed in quiet agony under the weight of the SA-80 assault rifle. He shifted his weight just a millimeter to keep the blood flowing to his locked knees. He was 26 hungover and profoundly tired of the public. Tourists milled about the gates of St. James's Palace in a sweaty, noisy swarm. They smelled of cheap sunscreen-stale coffee and exhaust fumes from the passing double-decker buses. A teenager in a neon tank top danced mockingly in his peripheral vision, trying to elicit a reaction. A woman shoved an iPad inches from his nose. Declan stared straight ahead, his jaw locked. Just 2 more hours, he told himself. 2 more hours of being a human landmark, a tourist attraction stripped of humanity for the sake of tradition. Then the rhythm of the crowd broke. It wasn't a sudden explosion or a shouted threat. It was a subtle tearing of the fabric of the mob. A high-pitched, ragged intake of breath cut through the ambient drone of foreign languages and camera shutters. Declan didn't move his head, but his eyes darted to the left. A small figure was weaving through the dense wall of adults, moving with a frantic, desperate energy. She was tiny, maybe 7 years old. Her pink sundress was stained with dark grease at the hem, and her bare knees were violently scraped, bleeding fresh, bright red lines down her shins. She wasn't looking back. She was entirely focused on the tall, rigid red figure standing in the sentry box. Declan braced himself. Usually kids just stared. Sometimes they waved. This girl was a projectile. She hit his legs with a heavy, jarring thud. Declan gritted his teeth, suppressing the instinct to step back. The girl threw her thin, sticky arms around his black trousers, burying her face into the scratchy wool. Her fingers gripped the fabric with terrifying strength. She was trembling so violently that the vibrations traveled straight up his legs. "Help!" she choked out. It wasn't a movie scream. It was a wet, suffocated sound, muffled by his trousers. "He's not my dad. Please, he's not my dad." Declan's breath hitched in his throat. The strict, unyielding laws of his post dictated that he remain a statue. If a member of the public touched a guard, the protocol was clear. Stamp the foot, bring the rifle to a port-arms position, and shout, "Step back from the King's Guard." He didn't do it. The girl smelled like stale sweat dust, and something sharp like unwashed panic. This wasn't a lost child throwing a tantrum. Declan had 2 younger sisters. He knew what a tantrum felt like. This was the raw, primal vibration of prey cornered by a predator. A man burst through the front line of tourists. He was out of breath, his face flushed. He wore a crisp, powder-blue button-down shirt and beige slacks. Expensive clothes, polished leather shoes. He didn't look like a kidnapper from a late-night crime show. He looked like an accountant who had missed his train. "Maya, God, there you are," the man gasped, slapping a hand to his chest. He offered an exasperated, embarrassed smile to the surrounding tourists, who had naturally backed away to form a loose ring around the sentry box. "I'm so sorry," she bolted. "1 minute we're looking at the pelicans in the park, and the next—" The man took a step toward Declan. "Come here, Maya. Stop bothering the soldier. We need to go back to the hotel. Mum's waiting." The girl screamed. It wasn't words this time. It was a high, tearing sound that scraped against Declan's eardrums. She dug her fingernails harder into his leg. Declan stared at the man. His hangover throbbed behind his eyes, a dull, pulsing ache. He analysed the man's face. The smile was perfectly apologetic, the posture non-threatening. But his eyes were completely dead. There was no relief in them, only a cold, sharp calculation, and a subtle, rapid twitch in his left jaw muscle. "Don't do it, Dec," a voice in his head warned. "Let the police handle it. Call for the duty officer. Stay in the box." "I apologize, mate," the man said, locking eyes with Declan. The polite facade slipped just a fraction, revealing a hard edge beneath the tone. "She hates the heat, hates the crowds. Come on, Maya." He reached out his thick, manicured hand, extending towards the girl's shoulder. The girl flinched so hard she hit her head against the wooden wall of the sentry box. Declan's body acted before his brain gave the official clearance. He didn't shout. He didn't stamp his foot. Instead, in one fluid, heavy motion, he stepped fully out of the sentry box, placing his bulk directly between the man and the trembling child. He brought the SA-80 rifle down from his shoulder, grasping it firmly in both hands across his chest. The heavy brass of the rifle butt clattered softly against his belt. "Step back," Declan said. His voice was completely devoid of the theatrical bellow usually reserved for tourists. It was low, raspy from disuse and entirely lethal. The man froze, his hands suspended in the hot air. The surrounding crowd went dead silent. Even the teenager in the neon tank top stopped moving, his jaw dropping. The King's Guard never spoke like that. They barked orders. They didn't converse. "Look," the man said, lowering his voice, trying to keep the interaction intimate away from the tourists' phones, which were now rising like a forest of black glass. "She's my daughter. We're having a bad day. You're overstepping your bounds, soldier." "I said," Declan repeated, his thumb resting dangerously close to the safety catch of the rifle. "Step back." The heavy silence stretched, suffocating the street. The only sounds were the distant rumble of traffic and the ragged, wet breathing of the little girl huddled behind Declan's boots. She had moved to hide completely behind his calves, using his imposing red-clad legs as a barrier. Declan could feel her small fingers gripping the seam of his trousers, slick with sweat and fear. The man in the blue shirt, who called himself her father, stood his ground for a fraction of a second too long. His eyes darted from the heavy steel of Declan's bayonet up to the shadowed eyes beneath the bearskin cap. The easy, apologetic smile had completely dissolved, replaced by a rigid mask of barely contained fury. "This is ridiculous," the man hissed, his voice dropping into an angry whisper. The smell of his cologne drifted over to Declan, something heavy, musky and expensive, clashing sharply with the acrid scent of the hot pavement. "You are making a massive mistake. I'm taking my daughter." He lunged forward. Not a full tackle, but a quick, desperate snatch aimed at the sliver of the girl's pink dress, visible behind Declan's knee. Declan didn't think. He pivoted, dropping his center of gravity. He drove the butt of his rifle down in a sharp, brutal arc, not hitting the man, but slamming it into the concrete inches from the man's polished Oxford shoes. The crack of metal on stone echoed like a gunshot. The man recoiled, stumbling backward into a startled tourist, his hands flying up defensively. "Move again and I'll put you on the ground," Declan said. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. The pure, unadulterated violence radiating from his rigid posture did the work. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a heavy, adrenaline-fueled rhythm that chased the last of his hangover away. He knew he was breaking every rule in the book. He was off his post, his weapon was lowered in a threatening posture, and he was actively engaging with a civilian. His career was likely vaporizing in the humid summer air. He didn't care. The girl's grip on his leg felt like an anchor to something real. A pair of regular police officers, metropolitan constables in their high-vis yellow jackets, finally pushed through the perimeter of gawking tourists. "Right, what's going on here?" the older constable, a thick-set man named Jenkins, demanded. He looked deeply irritated, eyeing Declan's lowered rifle with a mixture of confusion and professional alarm. "Guard, return to your post. We'll handle this." Declan didn't move. He tried to grab her. She says he's not her father. The man in the blue shirt immediately pivoted to the police, his face instantly transforming back into the exhausted, desperate parent. It was a terrifyingly smooth transition. "Officers, thank God. My daughter Maya. She has severe behavioral issues, oppositional defiant disorder. We're from America just visiting for the week, and she's having an absolute meltdown. She ran off, and now this soldier is pointing a weapon at me." Constable Jenkins frowned, turning to look at the little girl cowering behind Declan. "Is this true, sweetheart? Is this your dad?" The girl shook her head violently, her face still pressed against Declan's leg. "No," she whimpered, the sound muffled by the wool. "My dad is dead. My dad died." The man gave a heavy, tragic sigh, rubbing his temples. He reached into his back pocket. Declan tensed his grip, tightening on the rifle, but the man slowly pulled out a leather wallet. He extracted a driver's license and a folded piece of paper. "I have my ID and I have a photo of us right here on my phone. Look." He held out a smartphone. The screen showed a bright, clear photo of the man and the little girl sitting at a restaurant. The man was smiling. The girl was looking at the camera. The crowd muttered. The tide of public opinion, fickle and lazy, began to shift. A woman in a visor whispered loudly, "Oh, poor man. Kids with issues are so tough." Constable Jenkins looked at the photo, then at the man's ID. He nodded slowly. "All right, sir. Looks in order." He turned to Declan. "Mate, stand down. It's a family issue. You're causing a scene." Declan felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The evidence was right there. The police were satisfied. All he had to do was step aside, return to the sentry box, and let the man take the girl. It was the easy out. He looked down at the top of the girl's head. Her hair was matted, tangled with street dirt. He looked back up at the man. The man was smiling again, a tight, victorious smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He extended his hand towards the girl. "Come on, Maya, let's go get ice cream." Declan squinted. The afternoon sun caught the man's outstretched wrist. The cuff of his expensive blue shirt had pulled back slightly, revealing a pale, hairless ring of skin around his wrist. A tan line, a deep, distinct tan line where a heavy watch usually sat. Declan looked at the man's other wrist, bare. He looked at the phone the man had just produced. It was a cheap plastic model with a cracked screen, a burner, not the kind of phone a man in a tailored suit and handmade shoes carried. Then Declan remembered the photo. The girl in the photo was looking at the camera, yes. But her shoulders had been hunched. Her eyes hadn't been smiling. They had been wide and flat. It was the same look she had right now. "Wait," Declan said, his voice cutting through the constable's reassurances. Jenkins sighed. "Guard, I am giving you a lawful order to step back." "Look at his shoes," Declan interrupted, pointing a gloved finger at the man's feet. Jenkins blinked, confused. "What? Look at his shoes," Declan repeated, stepping slightly to the side to give the officers a better view, but still shielding the girl. "He said they were looking at the pelicans in St. James's Park. That means they were walking by the lake. The paths there are crushed red gravel and goose dirt." Declan looked the man dead in the eye. "His shoes are pristine, black leather polished to a mirror shine, not a speck of dust, not a scratch." The man's victorious smirk vanished. He glanced down at his feet, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his face for the first time. "And," Declan continued, his voice dropping lower, colder, "the girl has fresh grease on her dress, black grease, like the kind from a loading dock or a train yard, not a park." Jenkins frowned, looking closely at the man. The man took a slow, calculated step backward, away from the police, away from the crowd. "This is absurd." The man stuttered, his voice suddenly lacking its previous smooth confidence. "I demand to—" He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, he bolted. The man bolted. He didn't just run, he exploded into motion with the desperate, panicked violence of a cornered animal. His polished black Oxford shoes, the very shoes that had given him away, scrabbled frantically for traction on the slick, hot asphalt, emitting a sharp, unnatural squeak before he launched himself into the dense wall of tourists. "Hey!" Constable Jenkins roared, his voice cracking with sudden exertion. The younger officer beside him didn't waste breath yelling. He blew his whistle, a shrill, agonizing shriek that sliced through the ambient noise of the London street. The crowd screamed. The uniform wall of sweating, picture-taking tourists shattered like glass. People scrambled backward, tripping over each other, dropping melting ice cream cones and expensive cameras in their frantic bid to get out of the way. Declan's first instinct, hammered into him by years of infantry training, was to pursue. His muscles coiled his heavy boots, shifting to launch his weight forward. But a sudden sharp pain flared in his left leg. Maya, the little girl, had clamped her arms around his calf with the desperate strength of a drowning victim, her fingernails biting right through the thick scarlet wool of his trousers. He couldn't move. If he ran, he'd drag her across the concrete. "Stay behind me." Declan growled, his voice low and ragged. He lowered the SA-80 rifle, further tracking the chaos unfolding 20 yards away, his finger resting flat and rigid against the trigger guard. The chase was brief, brutal, and utterly devoid of cinematic grace. The man in the blue shirt shoved a screaming woman out of his path, sending her crashing into a metal trash bin. The delay cost him. The younger constable launched himself in a flying tackle, catching the man around the thighs. They hit the pavement with a sickening, heavy crunch. It was an ugly, desperate struggle. The man thrashed wildly, his tailored shirt tearing at the shoulder. He drove his elbow backward, catching the young cop in the teeth. Blood sprayed bright and startling against the drab grey pavement. Jenkins arrived a second later, pulling a canister of pepper spray from his vest. A quick hissing burst of orange mist caught the man in the face. The man screamed a wet, tearing sound, and his body seized up, hands clawing at his burning eyes. The wind caught a fraction of the pepper spray mist and carried it backward. Declan smelled it a second later, a harsh chemical fire that stung the back of his throat and made his eyes water instantly. The immediate threat was over. The man was pinned, handcuffed, and weeping in agony on the hot road. But the chaos had only just begun. Sirens began to wail in the distance, a rising mechanical howl that promised more noise, more questions, more bureaucratic nightmares. Declan looked down. Maya was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved in small, jagged spasms, her face completely hidden against the back of his knee. The heat radiating off the pavement was suffocating, trapped beneath the heavy overhang of his bearskin cap. His hangover throbbed a vicious, rhythmic drumbeat against his skull. He was sweating so heavily that his undershirt was glued to his ribs. He made a choice. He knew exactly what the disciplinary manual said. He knew what the consequences would be. He just didn't care anymore. Declan shifted the heavy assault rifle, resting the butt on the ground and gripping the barrel with his left hand. With his right, he reached up, unsnapped the heavy brass chin chain, and pulled the massive bearskin cap off his head. The sudden rush of hot, stagnant city air hitting his soaked scalp felt like an Arctic breeze. It was glorious, exposing, and highly illegal. He let the heavy cap drop to the pavement with a dull thud. Then, his joints popping loudly in protest, he knelt. The scratchy wool of his trousers pulled tight across his kneecaps. Maya flinched away, startled by the sudden movement. "It's over," Declan said. He kept his voice flat, steady, stripping away any trace of the towering, intimidating King's Guard. Without the hat, he was just a 26-year-old bloke with a brutal headache, a red face, and a horrible haircut. "They've got him." Maya peeked around his leg. She stared at the bearskin cap resting in the dirt, then slowly looked up at Declan's face. She didn't look relieved. She looked exhausted, her eyes sunken and hollow, in a way no child's should ever be. She tentatively reached out a small, grimy hand and touched the bright red fabric of his tunic, as if making sure he was actually real, and not just a statue that had come to life. "My dad didn't go to heaven," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the approaching sirens. "He went into the ground. I saw the box." Declan felt a cold, jagged rock form in his stomach. The cynicism that usually shielded him from the public cracked wide open. He didn't have a comforting platitude ready. He didn't know how to talk to kids about death. "I know, kid," Declan said quietly, awkwardly patting her grease-stained shoulder with his heavy, white-gloved hand. "I know." Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel behind him. Declan turned his head. Sergeant Major Collins was pushing through the perimeter of police officers. His face flushed a deep, dangerous purple. Collins was a man who worshipped protocol the way a zealot worshipped a deity. Seeing his guardsman off-post weapon grounded and uniform incomplete was akin to watching a cathedral burn. "Guardsman!" Collins roared, his voice vibrating with absolute fury. "What in the bloody hell do you think you are doing?" Declan looked from the screaming Sergeant Major to the quiet, trembling girl clinging to his sleeve. The military conditioning beaten into him through years of drills screamed at him to leap to attention, to salute, to apologize. Instead, Declan stayed on his knees. He looked Collins dead in the eye, his expression completely flat. "Protecting the public, sir." Declan replied, his voice devoid of any respect. "Just like it says in the brochure." The interior of the St. James's Palace guardroom was aggressively air-conditioned. The transition from the baking humid street to the sterile refrigerator-cold room shocked Declan's system. He shivered involuntarily, the sweat cooling to a layer of icy dampness against his skin. He sat on a hard metal folding chair, stripped of his heavy scarlet tunic and white belt. He wore only his sweat-stained olive undershirt and the dark wool trousers. His shoulders ached with a deep, bruised intensity, but his headache had sharpened into something crystalline and alert. Across the scuffed linoleum table sat Detective Inspector Reed. Reed looked like a man who hadn't slept since the previous decade. He smelled heavily of stale peppermint breath mints, cheap machine coffee, and unwashed cotton. He was methodically flipping through a manila folder, uncaring of the tense military personnel hovering near the doorway. Sergeant Major Collins stood in the corner, arms crossed, practically vibrating with suppressed rage. The military chain of command was currently warring with the Metropolitan Police over jurisdiction optics and who exactly was going to flay Declan alive. Reed closed the folder and tossed a small, cracked burner phone onto the table. It slid and hit Declan's knuckles. "His name is Philip Corby," Reed said. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp. "And you were spot on, guardsman. He's not a father. He's a professional retriever, a freelancer who specializes in extracting people who don't want to be found." Declan stared at the cheap plastic phone. Retrieving a 7-year-old, retrieving leverage. Reed corrected, pulling a peppermint from his pocket and unwrapping it with frustrating slowness. Maya's father wasn't just a bloke who died. His name was Arthur Hayes. He was a senior forensic accountant for a shipping conglomerate operating out of the Isle of Dogs. 2 weeks ago, Arthur found a massive gaping hole in the company's logistics ledger. Hundreds of shipping containers full of very illegal, very untaxed goods moving through the ports unnoticed. Declan frowned, the pieces clicking together with a grim inevitability. And he died. Car crash, Reed said, making air quotes with his fingers. The peppermint clacked against his teeth. Very tragic, very fiery. The police report said his brakes failed on a wet road. His wife Maya's mother didn't buy it for a second. She took the girl and went underground, bouncing between cheap motels. She knew they'd come for the files Arthur hid, and she knew they'd use Maya to get them. Declan rubbed his face, the stubble scratching against his palms. The sheer absurdity of it all weighed heavily on him. He had woken up that morning, annoyed that the mess hall was out of black pudding. Now he was sitting in the middle of a corporate assassination plot. How did Corby find her at the palace? Declan asked, his voice rough. The kid made a mistake. Reed sighed, leaning back in his chair. Grief makes people stupid, especially kids. Her dad had promised to take her to see the changing of the guard for her birthday next week. She got bored, cooped up in a motel room, while her mum was frantically calling journalists. Maya slipped out the fire escape, hopped on the tube and went to the palace by herself. Corby had been tracking their credit card pings. He lost the mother, but he picked up the kid's trail on the CCTV network. Reed leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, fixing Declan with a sharp, calculating look. He was 5 minutes away from throwing her in the back of a panel van and disappearing forever. If you had stayed at attention, if you had stamped your foot and told her to back away. Reed trailed off, letting the silence hang heavy and suffocating in the cold room. Declan looked down at his hands. He felt a phantom grip on his calf, the memory of tiny, desperate fingers digging into the wool. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt sick. "Where is she now?" Declan asked. "Safe," Reed said. "We scooped the mother up an hour ago. They're in a secure Met facility, armed guards the works. Corby is singing like a canary to save his own skin, giving up the executives who hired him." Collins stepped forward from the corner, clearing his throat loudly. "Inspector, while the army appreciates the gravity of the situation, the fact remains that Guardsman Declan abandoned his post, engaged in a physical altercation, and broke centuries of established protocol. This is an internal disciplinary matter." Reed stood up. He wasn't a tall man, but he carried a heavy, authoritative exhaustion that made him seem immovable. He looked at Collins with pure, unfiltered disdain. "Sergeant Major," Reed said coldly, "your boy here stopped a targeted kidnapping by a known violent operative. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police is currently drafting a letter of commendation. Several hundred tourists caught the whole thing on video, and they aren't talking about a soldier breaking rules. They're talking about the King's Guard defending a terrified child." Reed pointed a finger at Collins. "If you try to quietly court-martial him, the press will eat you alive. You don't have a disciplinary problem. You have a PR goldmine. I suggest you figure out how to smile for the cameras." Reed turned back to Declan, his expression softening just a fraction. He tapped his knuckles twice on the metal table. "Good work, son. Seriously." The detective walked out the heavy metal door, clicking shut behind him. The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. The air conditioner hummed a low, mechanical drone. Collins stared at the closed door, his jaw working furiously. He looked back at Declan, who was still sitting in his undershirt, staring blankly at the burner phone on the table. The anger in Collins's eyes hadn't vanished, but it had been forcefully shoved behind a wall of grim realization. The police were right. Politics would save Declan's career, even if it ruined the Sergeant Major's day. "Get your tunic on, guardsman." Collins muttered, his voice exhausted and hollow. "And wipe your boots. You look like a bloody disgrace." Declan didn't say a word. He stood up slowly, every muscle protesting, and reached for the heavy red wool. As he lifted the tunic, he noticed a dark, thick smudge of grease near the hem. He ran his thumb over it. The stain wouldn't wash out easily. It would probably ruin the uniform. Declan smiled. Just a tiny, cynical twitch of his lips, and pulled the tunic over his shoulders. The summer storm finally broke at dusk, shattering the oppressive August heat with violent, heavy drops of rain that hissed against the baking asphalt. Declan stood in the subterranean loading bay of the police precinct, shivering slightly. The military had officially confiscated his grease-stained tunic for evidence, though Declan suspected Sergeant Major Collins just couldn't bear to look at the ruined fabric. In its place, they had issued him a pristine, stiff replacement that smelled sharply of dry-cleaning chemicals. It felt heavy, foreign, and entirely unearned. A sleek, unmarked grey transit van idled in the centre of the concrete bay. Its exhaust plumed in the damp subterranean air, smelling of rich diesel and wet dust. Detective Inspector Reed stood by the sliding door, holding a battered umbrella that looked like it had survived a war. "They're moving them to a secure location in Yorkshire tonight," Reed said, his voice echoing flatly off the concrete pillars. He offered Declan a lukewarm paper cup of machine coffee. New names, new national insurance numbers, the whole witness protection circus. Declan took the coffee. It tasted like burnt copper, but the heat seeping through the thin cardboard felt good against his numb fingers. "And Corby," squealing, Reed replied, crunching on another peppermint. He gave up 2 executives at the shipping firm before his lawyer even sat down. The Financial Crimes Unit is raiding their Canary Wharf offices right now. It's going to be a bloodbath of white-collar indictments. The heavy metal doors of the precinct's basement elevator clattered open. 2 plainclothes officers stepped out, flanking a woman who looked like she was holding herself together with cheap tape and sheer willpower. Chloe Hayes was thin, her eyes bruised with exhaustion, her hair pulled back into a messy, uneven knot. She wore an oversized grey sweater that swallowed her small frame, and she gripped a battered canvas duffel bag like it was a life preserver. Behind her, holding the hem of the oversized sweater, was Maya. The little girl had been scrubbed clean. The black grease was gone from her knees, replaced by 2 bright, garish superhero band-aids. She wore a clean yellow t-shirt and jeans, but her eyes were exactly the same, hollow, ancient and hyper-vigilant. Chloe stopped when she saw Declan. She dropped the duffel bag. It hit the concrete with a heavy thud. She didn't say a word. She just walked across the oil-stained floor and threw her arms around Declan's neck. Declan froze. He was a foot taller than her, encased in rigid wool and brass buttons. He stood there awkwardly, his arms pinned to his sides, the hot coffee sloshing precariously in his hand. Chloe was crying quietly, her tears soaking into the stiff collar of his new tunic. She smelled of stale cigarette smoke, sour adrenaline, and cheap motel soap. It wasn't a beautiful cinematic embrace. It was messy, desperate, and painfully tight. "Thank you," she choked out her fingers, digging into his shoulder blades. "They would have killed her too. I know they would have. Thank you." "Just doing the job, Mom," Declan muttered, his voice hoarse. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The job was to stand still. Chloe pulled back, wiping her face with the back of her sleeve, leaving a smudge of mascara across her cheek. She offered a trembling, embarrassed smile and stepped aside, Maya stood a few feet away. She didn't run up to him this time. She just stared at his boots, then slowly tracked her gaze up to his face. Without the towering bearskin cap to shadow his features, she could see the heavy bags under his eyes and the dark stubble shadowing his jaw. She reached into the pocket of her jeans. Her small fist emerged, clutching something tight. She walked up to Declan and held out her hand. Declan knelt. His joints popped again, a sharp sound in the echoing garage. He placed his coffee on the ground and held out his large, white-gloved hand. Maya dropped something into his palm. It was a piece of hard butterscotch candy, wrapped in crinkly, faded yellow cellophane. It was slightly melted from the heat of her pocket, sticky and completely unremarkable. "For your headache," Maya said. Her voice was flat, devoid of a child's usual lilt. "You look like my dad did when he had a headache." Declan stared at the sticky piece of candy, resting against the pristine white cotton of his glove. A massive, aching lump formed in his throat, thick and suffocating. He closed his fingers over it carefully. "Thanks, kid," Declan said quietly. "I needed this." Maya gave a single sharp nod. She turned around, grabbed her mother's hand and climbed into the back of the grey van. The sliding door slammed shut with a heavy metallic finality. Reed gave Declan a brief, respectful nod, then climbed into the passenger seat. The van shifted into gear tires, hissing on the damp concrete, and drove up the ramp, disappearing into the rainy London night. Declan stayed kneeling on the cold floor for a long time, listening to the fading hum of the engine. 2 weeks later, the heat wave broke, permanently replaced by the damp grey chill of a typical English autumn. The crowds outside St. James's Palace were thinner but just as loud. The Ministry of Defence had successfully spun the incident into a massive public relations victory. There had been press conferences, a brief spot on the BBC, and a commendation pinned to Declan's chest by a beaming general who didn't know his last name. The internet had called him a hero. Collins had called him a lucky idiot. Declan didn't care about any of it. He stood in the sentry box, his heels pressed together, his SA-80 rifle resting perfectly flush against his shoulder. The heavy bearskin cap was back on his head, the brass chain biting familiarly into his chin. He was a statue again, a piece of the scenery, a human landmark. A woman in a bright yellow raincoat stepped up to the line, holding up her phone to take a selfie with him. She leaned in dangerously close, trying to capture the stoic, unblinking glare of the King's Guard. Declan stared straight ahead, his breathing slow and measured. He felt the familiar, dull ache in his knees and the suffocating weight of the wool. Outwardly, he was the exact picture of unyielding tradition. But tucked deep inside the breast pocket of his tunic, resting right over his heart, was a sticky, half-melted piece of butterscotch candy wrapped in faded cellophane. He didn't move. He didn't blink. But as the tourist snapped her photo and walked away, Declan's grip on his rifle tightened just a fraction. He was still standing guard, but now he was actually watching. Sometimes real heroism isn't about grand gestures or flawless victories. It's about making a messy, split-second choice to protect the vulnerable, even when it costs you everything. Declan broke the oldest rules in the book to save a little girl, proving that humanity must always outrank tradition. What did you think of his choice and how he handled the aftermath? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more deeply human, gripping stories.